All right, 3, 2, 1. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Gary Meece. He's the author of a number of books on the West Memphis 3, very thorough, first-person referenced information on this notorious case of the West Memphis 3. The titles of the 2-volume version are Blood on Black and Where the Monsters Go. They're both available on Amazon. They have excellent reviews, but Gary's also been doing a very informative podcast. The title of the podcast is The Case Against, and it's Gary Meece, Meece, and he's currently on podcast number 49. He's mostly focused on the West Memphis 3, going in detail and rebutting so many of these false narratives and false positions of many of the West Memphis 3 are innocent or Terry Dunnett types. But he's got some great titles on there. One is Rough Rebuttal, ID Comedy of Errors, Rough Stuff, and The Rough Deception. So we're going to go in detail about that. But Gary, are you there?
Yes, I am, William.
Awesome. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who don't know your background or your familiarity with the West Memphis 3, can you talk a little bit about yourself and your first-person knowledge of the case?
Well, I don't want to overstate it, but I worked at the Memphis Commercial Appeal from 1980 to 2008. I did not personally cover the case during that time. I'd never try to give the suggestion that I did. And then from 2010 to 2014, I worked at the West Memphis Evening Times. I was the managing editor there for almost all that time. And I did cover a number of matters there dealing with Damien Echols. There was some litigation going on in 2013. So I'm quite familiar with the area. And needless to say, I really have a long background in journalism. I primarily consider myself to be a print journalist, but I am doing some podcasting, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. But the Commercial Appeal did some very detailed, many articles, correct? On the West Memphis.
That's correct. That's correct, William. And in fact, they wrote the original book was written by 3 journalists from the Commercial Appeal. Not me, but 3 guys: Bart Sullivan, Mark Paraskia, and Guy Reel.
Right.
During the time when all this was going on, I was sitting at a desk that was literally probably 10 feet away from the Metro desk. So I heard stuff going on all day long. I think Guy Reel probably sat almost directly across from me. So I had quite a few conversations with him, as I recall, and heard many conversations with other people about the West Memphis 3 during that time. It was a big case. It still is. We're going to be talking about Bob Ruff, and I was rewatching his for the 3rd time, which is kind of a slog, honestly, to get through 3 times. But I was watching again today his ID network shows, and he describes West Memphis as basically falling into this terrible state. He seems to blame it on this crime. I'm not sure West Memphis is actually in worse shape now than it was in 1993, but it's not because of they are known, and they hate the idea that they're known for the West Memphis 3 and basically not known for anything else. But if they're in worse shape now than they were in 1993, and it's arguable they're not, right, it's not because of the West Memphis 3 case. There are lots of other factors that would play into that.
Do you recollect the title of the Paraskia book, the real book?
Blood of Innocence.
Blood of Innocence, right? And it's almost never referenced by West Memphis 3 supporters. Like, I had to actually go through the footwork to find out that it actually existed.
Yeah, it's out of print. It has been for a long time. It was somewhat outdated almost as soon as it appeared, because it was really written on the fly. It was written while the case was going on, and it was put out very quickly. And so all the stuff that's gone on since with the celebrities, the Paradise Lost movies, et cetera, it simply doesn't touch on that. And a lot of things we now know because we have access to fuller records than they did then. They simply didn't have access to at the time. So it showed, some of it's just an example of how journalism has changed with the difference in the internet. Because I can tell you, I know those guys. Those are Sullivan and Perisky in particular is a first-rate reporter, journalist, all the way around. Good guys.
Gotcha. So, I mean, they did a good job. I mean, there are some pretty, I remember it being kind of very lurid in some of the first-person accounts, but it was also voted down on Amazon. I think there were a significant number of people who only give it 1 star as not being like a truthful version, something that happened to me as well on Amazon. But kind of getting back to the original, what drew you to start the book, and can you talk about your research? I take it you've obviously looked through all of the Callahan materials, et cetera, right?
Well, I was working in West Memphis, and I was I was familiar with the case. I remember trying to work out all the family relations back in 1993 and being very, very challenged by all that. But I was working in West Memphis, and I got a copy of a letter that Todd and Dana Moore and Terry Hobbs had written to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, complaining about the potential nomination of Paradise Lost 3 for this Oscar nomination. And I was reading through there, and I suddenly was hit very deeply by the idea that these poor people had really been abused by Hollywood. And they didn't get any relief from Hollywood at that point. And the more I looked at it, I said, there's only been one side of this case that's been told. It really deserves, and I tried to be as objective as possible, but I do take the position that they're guilty, and rightly so, based on the evidence. And everything I'd been seeing up to that point was, with the possible exception of the first Paradise Lost movie, which is somewhat ambiguous, you could draw maybe. I still thought they were guilty after seeing that movie, but everything that had been produced since gave the impression that they're just terribly wrongfully convicted, and this is a terrible miscarriage of justice, and somebody else did it.
Right.
And this is a continuing thing. This is what Ruff is doing now. Is he's continuing this idea that this is a terrible miscarriage of justice. Surely somebody else did it, and we just have to get outraged enough, and we'll solve this problem.
Right.
Anyway, I was outraged enough at that time that I took it upon myself to begin doing some heavy duty research on it. And I was busy working at the time in a very taxing job, and had a lot of personal responsibilities and so forth, so beyond the job. So it took me quite a while to get around to finishing up the book, but I started it very soon after that, very soon after reading that letter.
Right, and that was, I don't think that it was the Paradise. It was the third one in the series, but it
was the third one, yes.
Right, it didn't receive an award, but it was up against, and that was kind of one of the confusing things for me to look at the case too. Is what is this Hollywood involvement, and what's going on with this kind of thing, and why are they blaming Byers and then Hobbs 2 and 3? So there's definitely some head scratching going on, at least for me, but. Maybe we can talk about how, I know that you and I had talked about Ruff. He has done this kind of series where he addressed it, then he went and worked on some case in Texas, and now he's come back and he's called it the Forgotten West Memphis 3, as if the children are forgotten. And now he's kind of readdressing this, and they did this show on Oxygen, and you've definitely been addressing that. Can you talk a little bit about what your kind of initial impressions were?
Right. Well, his conclusion, this grew out of his podcast. And the conclusion of his podcast, among other things, was that he felt that the West, and he doubled down on this with Jim Clemente this weekend, that the West Memphis Three, all three of them had these alibis that were just so good that they couldn't possibly have committed the crime. And so therefore, it was incumbent upon him to go out and seek the real killers. Well, none of those alibis hold up. They were all the ones that were presented in court were demolished. The ones that weren't presented in court don't hold up either.
Right.
And I could go into long detail about all that.
Well, let's do that. Let's look at all three, because Eccles said he was on the phone. Baldwin's attorney didn't proffer an alibi, and Miss Kelly said he was at a wrestling match. Can you address each one of those in turn?
Well, Eccles at trial made two alibis. One, he testified he was on the phone, and his family testified he was on the phone. He did not bring forward the witnesses that would have corroborated his testimony, Jennifer Bearden and Holly George and Heather Clyatt, who was Jason Baldwin's girlfriend, that he claimed he was talking to, because none of their statements to police backed up his story. They all said they weren't talking to him in this crucial time frame. Really, they didn't talk to him from about 4:30 or so in the afternoon until at least 9:20 at night, and possibly much later. And they tried to call him at home, and he wasn't at home, which means that, he wasn't at home. His grandmother said, he's not at home now. He had this other family visit that he supposedly went on, and it turns out that the timestamp that was used for that most prominently was the little girl said that her boyfriend had a concert within that same week, and it turns out it was 2 weeks later. Right. And so cast doubt on that. The Miskelly trial, he had two alibis, attempted alibis. One was a series of police calls involving a slapping incident of his child. He was supposedly at the scene of the police calls. The problem is the police who knew him, 3 different police officers testified, said he wasn't on the scene. So much for that alibi. His wrestling, he had a long list of people. He had over a dozen people he had testified for alibis, and he had a lot of people testifying in the wrestling match. The problem is when they brought forward, we went May 5th, 1993, when we went to Dias, Arkansas, to this old theater and did this wrestling match. The police went and checked with the owner of the wrestling of the theater, and it turns out that receipt that they claimed for needed signed to use the theater for the night they were using the they were going to have the wrestling match was dated the week before and not the date that they were claiming. So it cast doubt on the wrestling match.
Right. And please continue.
And then Jason Baldwin has claimed he didn't offer an alibi at trial. He's since claimed he was talking on the phone to girls, the same girls that actually say they didn't talk to Jason that evening at all. It's the same 3 girls. And he also claimed, he played went to Walmart with Ken Watkins, who gave his little friend Ken Watkins, who actually gave a statement to police that ran totally at variance with everybody else, including Jason Baldwin, and gave another statement to police that Damian Eccles had actually confessed to him, and then failed a polygraph. It was a double negative polygraph. He denied that the story he was telling was true, which meant it was true. And so he would have been a great witness for Jason on the stand. And otherwise, he really didn't have an alibi. He just makes a claim that he does.
Well, he's actually, after his conviction, I think since he's been out, he's made the claim that there was the Asian kid. Right, I think his name was Dan Nam or whatever.
Don Nam. Right. Don Nam was supposedly at the Walmart as well. Don Nam gave a statement to police and said he'd seen Dominique Tier, who was Damian Eccles' pregnant girlfriend at that time, and Jason Baldwin that afternoon. And then he promptly retracted that statement, said he was mistaken, it was a different day.
Right, and that's in the court files. Like, there's actually a written statement by Dan Nance saying he was wrong. So it's remarkable that Baldwin is using that as an excuse when it's directly contradicted in writing in a police statement.
Right. Well, what's even more remarkable is Damien Echols, particularly mentioning these girls, and they continue to give states in Rule 37 hearings and so forth. I think Jennifer Bearden's given at least 3 statements after the convictions, and she doesn't really change her story in substance, and it does not give Damien Echols an alibi.
So Ruff is saying there's these ironclad alibis that are contradicted by the court records and statements in court that were overturned. But it gets even worse than that. I mean, what other glaring problems are in these Ruff podcasts or the shows? I should say.
There are many other problems. The big problem is he's basing his whole investigation now on. He says he's not interested in getting new statements, new witnesses. He is banking everything on forcing the prosecuting attorney, Scott Ellington, to turn over evidence to be retested for DNA. The problem with this is the problems are manifold with this. Number one, Bob Ruff has no standing to do that. Number two, the only people who might have standing to do it theoretically are the 3 killers, and they signed an agreement in 2011 with their Alford plea that all these legal actions are over with, and it could be argued that they might actually abrogate their legal agreement for their release if they file additional legal actions on this.
Right. So they're still under probation. If they filed additional legal actions that go against the agreement they signed with the best attorneys possible, they'd all go back to jail.
They could. I mean, and you don't know what's going to happen when you go to court. So it depends on what mood the court's in that particular day.
Right.
And so, but in theory, they could do that. In theory, they could have done that any time in the last 9 years. They haven't done it. The only one I could really see of potentially doing it, Echols doesn't want to be bothered with it because he thinks he's got more important things to do. Miskelly really just doesn't want to be bothered with any of it. Jason Baldwin would make sense as the only one who might be willing to do that, but he's had the opportunity to do that for the last 9 years. Another big problem with this is redundant. They went through years and years of legal actions to enable them to get access to a list of items for new DNA testing, and all the way back really at the turn of the century, and then it went up to, and they finally, they finally got approval for that, and then it went through a much longer process.
Right.
And in 2011, they were coming up. We know they had basically nothing on a lot of the DNA as of July, because Mara Leverett wrote a story about their attorney Patrick Binkin, one of their attorneys, Patrick Binkin, meeting with Dustin Daniel, who was the Attorney General of the state of Arkansas, and Binkin's telling Dustin McDaniel they're coming up empty on the DNA. So their evidentiary hearing was going to be based on the chance of retrial was going to be based on potentially 2 major issues. One would be new evidence, specifically DNA evidence, and the other would be jury misconduct, but only for Echols and Baldwin. Miskelly would not be able to claim any kind of relief for jury misconduct in Echols and Baldwin's trial. So if there was no new DNA evidence or other new evidence, then he had no basis for seeking a new trial whatsoever.
Right.
So of course, So of course, Miskelly would have wanted to take the Alford plea.
And that was right. And there was like the hearing was December, right? They were let out in August.
Yes.
So there was an upcoming hearing. They had spent all this time. There was a statute that was passed in Arkansas that allowed for opening of a trial if there was new incriminating or evidence that would tend to get somebody off the thing. And that's really what the lever that they focused on in the appeals process to get up to that point in 2011.
Right. Right. It was particularly DNA evidence. But the thing is they had the opportunity granted to them to test new DNA evidence. They had the new DNA evidence tested. But guess what? Nobody knows what the results are except for like an allusion to the results in a Maura Leverett story. Nobody knows what those results actually are. The defendants the killers haven't released it to the public. Right. Bob Ruff skirts around the issue of even asking for what those results might be, and you would think they might have, if they do nothing but just show, well, there was no sign of the West Memphis Three in any of this DNA evidence, but we can't find anybody else either. It would show something, but so far we have seen nothing on that front for 9 years now, and the court is not going to look kindly on that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Not think.
Yeah, and but they say they're more than willing to have this PR approach that they found a care that is Terry Hobbs. They claim to be initially consistent, but they don't mind that kind of bleeding over into, we found Terry Hobbs here on the scene, and then therefore that conclusively proves he did it, which is really a stretch.
It's a huge stretch, yeah. And because it's mitochondrial DNA, it's only consistent with a small percent. It's consistent with a small percentage of people in the world, but it's still millions of people any way you cut it. And even if you cut it down to just who was in West Memphis at the time, we're still talking about hundreds of people in West Memphis who would be a match for that mitochondrial DNA. And that's probably not even understating it with, with the population being, some common ancestors, ancestry in certain areas, I'm not trying to get into cousin marrying in Arkansas or anything, but it's just a fact that the gene pool gets smaller in these smaller backward areas. So there would be more matches rather than few as compared to, say, a general population over the United States at all, overall. So it doesn't prove that it's Terry Hobbs' hair. They also dragged poor David Jacoby, who was Terry Hobbs' alibi witness, into this, and he had a hair that was found at the scene with a similar sort of mitochondrial DNA match. And he was really crucified in the West of Memphis movie, which was produced by one of the killers, Damien Eccles. He's one of the producers, obviously not the other one. But not exactly an objective source.
Right.
And so the question becomes, at this point, if for Bob Ruff to pull this to get his audience, he's got tears in his eyes.
Yeah.
He's all but screaming, not on the phone, but away from the phone. He's all but screaming at Scott Ellington for not returning his phone calls and so forth. Well, number one, Scott Ellington just got elected judge. He takes office in January. We're having a coronavirus shutdown right now. Everything's less than it usually is, and on top of that, 2 weeks ago, Jonesboro, which is where Scott Ellington lives and where his offices are, was hit by a devastating tornado. So Scott Ellington has bigger problems than some boob podcaster from Podunkville who shows up there and demands to see evidence he's not entitled to see.
Right, with really no credentials. He's just a self-described investigator. I think he was a fire investigator, or self-claimed, but yeah, it's
Right.
very interesting. And that I saw him crying at the beginning, and it was really just an appeal to emotion. It wasn't sensible, and it was, I just knew that it was going to be the start of something grim. That that this is the way it started. Uh,
Well, no, and a lot of it's very. I found it more humorous the first time I saw it because it was so bumbling and inept. But he has this whole thing about he's going to do what he calls the victimology. I have nothing against with this in theory, but the idea is you look at the behavior of the boys leading up to the killings, and this will give us some insight into why these boys are dead. Well, it's going to give very limited insight into that because everything that happened to get them into the woods at 6:30 at night that particular day had very little to do with what happened when they got to the woods. This is not about who they talked to that afternoon, or he makes a big deal. He contradicts even what's on the record. But he brings up a new guy who says he was the last one to see them going into the woods. Well, honestly, who cares? Who cares? They were seen going into the woods about 6:30. Who cares who was the last one to see them? He brings up the so-called fourth boy who supposedly went into the woods with them. He brings up this poor George Taylor fellow who seemed very confused, and this went on for agonizing minute after minute with rough playing to the cameras, acting like he's a big investigator, pushing this guy around. And it turns out, and the executive producer or whoever was on the scene with him basically saying, enough's enough. Let's stop this. And it went on and on and on.
right, like he followed down that trail, but it turns out that guy was either lying or he couldn't have been the fourth person. So why did you include that in the show? It's incredible.
Right. Why put that in the show? Speaking of red herrings, and he used that term, it was a big red herring. His idea of a red herring was Bojangles. Mr. Bojangles, who supposedly was the name that's been given to this guy who went into this fried chicken place that night, had blood on him, had mud, went to the ladies' restroom, acted deranged. And, he's a mile and a half or so from the crime scene, and it's an hour or so later. Well, he went to a lot of trouble to prove, oh, yeah, if he ran down this muddy ditch in late evening or night, he could have gotten there in time. Well, and then he concludes, but he couldn't have done it anyway. So he went to all this big demonstration to show Mr. Bojangles could show up at the restaurant just to go, well, make any difference because he didn't have anything to do with it anyway. I concur with his opinion on that, but it was all a big show. He makes a big show out of not being able to contact Jesse Miskelly Jr. Apparently all he had to do was just do some real basic research and hunt it. He was going to hunt him down a little bit, but it wasn't as if it was going to take Sherlock Holmes to figure that out. And in fact, we see it wasn't really that hard. He just didn't put that much work into it. And then he puts in all these phone calls to Ellington, and he's continually getting mad about Ellington not being on the phone, to the point his producer says, his producer's starting to have problems with the attitude. So, but that's his personality. His personality has a great deal to do with, it rubs me the wrong way, it has a great deal to do with the show, but the fact is when I say there's a deception going on there, the deception is that he thinks he's going to be able to do something about this case. I don't think he actually thinks that. I don't think he's that stupid. I think he wants to deceive his audience and get them outraged and all riled up and bother Scott Ellington. And he's hoping that maybe the state of Arkansas will blink and actually hand over the evidence, but they're not going to do that. And then this case is going to go away again.
Hey, man, he calls his listeners the Bob Ruff Army. So these guys, he's deliberately, just like you said, he's deliberately kind of riling them up and trying to get them involved, and it's a crowdsourced investigation, which is terrifying. I mean, and if you go like his first case, which was Adnan Syed, like that was conclusively, put down on appeal. The highest court in Maryland basically said, "Hey, this is a guilty thing," and it just went away. Like it was nothing that stood. So this won't be the first
and
time.
Apparently Ruff in that particular season. Apparently Ruff did what he does, which is he went out of his way to make High's boyfriend at the time, Don, I think the guy's name. I know the case a little bit, but Don, Ruff went out of the way to make him look, without specifically accusing him, make him look like he's the one who actually committed the crime. And it was all based on some sort of timestamp at some sort of photo shop.
Yeah, it was like a glass place, right? It wasn't a glassware place.
Right. No, I think it was a photo. It was a photo place. I can't remember the name. There was a big chain. I just can't remember the name right now.
No, you're right.
I don't follow him. I mean, I don't listen to his podcast. I haven't listened to his podcast other than was Memphis 3. But so he has a history of doing this. He has a history of really. He talked to Terry Hobbs. We know he talked to Terry Hobbs. It's supposed to be an off-the-record interview. And then he talks about what was said at the off-the-record interview, which is just unethical, but he doesn't care. Yeah. He brings in a child of two of the parents who's having some sort of dispute with her parents about something has nothing to do with the West Memphis 3, except that they're related to the victim, and has a big interview with her and just basically smears people. He smears people, and because he gets, and then he attacks the police, the prosecutors, the judges, and he keeps saying how they're corrupt. He keeps saying there hasn't been a real investigation up to now, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, it's
outrageous. It was a police investigation. Police investigation. They had a really good. The guy cut all sorts of corners. Ron Lax was in there very early on for the defense as a private investigator. He did a lot of stuff. I don't think he was doing the right thing, but he was being an advocate for the defense very early on. And of course, after the movies came out, they had this huge amount of money available to them, and they've had all sorts of investigators, attorneys, experts available to them for years and years and years. And yet all these questions persist because the questions ultimately aren't answerable by anything except they're guilty. So we're going to keep bringing this up again. Let's cast doubt on eyewitness statements. Let's cast doubt on this witness for that reason, that witness. Jesse Miskelly can confess 10 times. That's one way to count it. Or 5 times is another, like he's really officially got 5 different confessions, which means he goes to an appeals court. What's the appeals court going to do? They're going to look at this guy who's confessed 5 times and say, oh, yeah, you deserve another trial, guy.
Right. Well, the thing is, they never mentioned this, Gary, is that the case went to the Supreme Court of Arkansas, and they affirmed the lower court. So that's already happened. That appeal, not on the DNA, but just a standard appeal, was looked at by another court.
Yes. Yeah, the lower court did turn them down on the DNA, but the Supreme Court did approve that. But the lower court, of course it was appealed. It was a death penalty case. It went to the Supreme Court there. The Supreme Court didn't have any problem with it. There's been no major ethical probes of the
great point, excellent point. Yeah,
are the police? The police made mistakes with this. I've yet to read an account of a major police investigation of a big, really, crime that's really sort of way out of the loop. Like a Manson murder or Son of Sam or whatever you want, something that's so far out. And this is one of those cases. where the police didn't make major mistakes, but ultimately, because they kept doing their jobs, they honed in on who the perpetrator was. It just took them a while.
Right.
And that's what happened here. It wasn't a matter of picking Damien Eccles out immediately because he was wearing a black T-shirt.
Right, that's the old argument, the laser focus or the Damien Eccles, what do they call it, the zone or whatever. But it took them a month to actually arrest him, right? May 5th to June 3rd, right?
May 5th to June 3rd. By June 9th or 10th, they already had him pegged as a really their best suspect because number one, he'd been seen. We had eyewitnesses who'd seen him walking away from the scene of the crime. He gave some really, really bad answers, really suspicious answers to an FBI questions off an FBI checklist. He kept changing his alibis. Even early on, he was changing his alibi times. He failed a polygraph. He refused to. He threw up. He refused to continue talking to.
Right. He said, he told the cops, let me talk to my mom and then I'll tell you everything. And then he talked to his mom and clammed up.
Right. So very early on, they had good reason to suspect him with a polygraph, an eyewitness sighting, and two disastrous interviews with police. They already had good reason to suspect him. They were waiting for more evidence. They continued looking at other people. There were dozens of people that were polygraphed that had nothing to do with Damien Eccles. Even Mara Leverett, I think it's in, the ID Network also did a horrible version of this. Maybe it was in the ID Network where she talks about all the other people that were looked at as potential suspects. She does get some things right. She doesn't get much right. It's not that she doesn't get things right, but she deliberately leaves things out and slants things to make it look like the West Memphis Three couldn't possibly have committed these crimes, in which, if you slant the evidence enough, yeah, they look innocent. It's the same old story with the Paradise Lost movies.
Right. Something I'd like to touch on is, can you talk about Bob Ruff's animal predation theories and why there's real problems there?
Well, number one, it's not based on. It's not really based. The idea is that he's claiming that all the wounds were caused, except for some wounds to the head, were caused by animals. There's been some medical experts for the defense who said basically the same thing. Warner Spitz claimed, for his story to make any sense, Warner Spitz, who's a very well-known forensic pathologist, literally wrote a book on it. He claimed that his theory was that large dogs somehow dragged the bodies out of the ditch after death, slammed their heads against trees, and then somehow they ended up back in the water. That is the scenario that would have had to have happened with Dr. Warner Spitz. There's some other people who aren't quite that outrageous, but the idea is that turtles would have eaten would have caused these kind of wounds. Ruff is basing a lot of what he's doing on his experiment, in which he dropped a couple of chicken carcasses in the middle of the day in warm weather down into the large drainage bayou called 10 Mile Bayou that ran by the kill site. He came back 4 hours later, and the chicken carcasses were eaten apparently by turtles. All well and good. The problem is the large drainage ditch is not where the boys were left. They were left in a small. It was a relatively small, muddy ditch, and it was also a drainage ditch that emptied into that larger ditch. And it was about 2 to 3 feet deep, deeper in some places than others. There may have been some turtles in there. I don't discount the idea that maybe some predation went on, But, there were some real problems. The boys were smashed down into the mud, which means that turtles would not have access. The boys were placed in at night, which means that it was turtles feed generally during the day. Uh, and when they drained the ditch, they found no turtles. During the day, when the turtles would ordinarily have been feeding, the woods were full of people searching for the victims, which means even if there were turtles there and they were active, they wouldn't stay active for very long because basically they run away. If they see, they're very, very observant. And if they see a sign of a person, they're gone.
And the turtles have suddenly grown into giant prehistoric beasts too. I think that was the director of West of Memphis called them giant beasts, and there's real problems. I mean, we know,
right.
But the interesting thing is Spitz never disagreed with the findings of the state forensic examiner. I think it was Peretti, and there was somebody else sitting in with Peretti. It wasn't just him.
Oh, he did. He did. Some of the others didn't, but he did. He said all three boys drowned. The problem, and this is a big problem with the animal predation theory. Two of the boys drowned. They were also beaten horribly and scratched up and otherwise attacked.
Stabbed in the face.
Stevie Branch was stabbed in the face. Christopher Byers died of multiple injuries, according to Peretti, and he apparently bled out. He had virtually no blood left in his body. So he didn't drown. And so it raises a question of how the injuries, if you believe in the animal predation, then you have to believe that the animals attacked him in such a way that he bled out before his body was placed in the water. It just simply makes no sense. What does make sense is if they're in the water, they're bleeding, maybe a few small predators come up and, you use your imagination on that, but there's blood in the water and attracts some small predators. I don't think that's even that unlikely. But as far as the major wounds, it just doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't hold up with the evidence. Adding further to this, if you just simply look at how the wounds, they don't look like. I mean, there's a lot of the wounds that are marks that are left from a knife that would be exactly is probably the same knife, but if it's not the same knife, it was a very similar knife to the knife that was found behind Jason Baldwin's house, known as the Lake Knife, in November of 1993. And
it's like heavily serrated. It's like a very strong serration.
Right. And if put that across your skin, and you will have something that will look like scratch marks. But you can see the difference between an animal scratch marks and scratch marks made by some mechanically made device. And if you look at the autopsy photos, for those who really want to look at some really terrible, terrible photos, those are horrible. If you look at those, what you're seeing are wounds that are left by some sort of mechanically made device and not by an animal. And I'm not an expert on that. I'm just saying I'm just seeing what I see.
Right. Gary, we are at 45 minutes. Is there anything that you'd like to add or promote or anything I missed?
No, I could go on about this for quite a while, but we covered the big things, William. I do appreciate this. I appreciate your other work. I know you could. I saw your interview with Opperman the other day. He's a great host, by the way. But you could talk for the hour too. So But thanks for having me on. I do appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad that you were made it, and people need to get your books. Blood on Black, Where the Monsters Go. Very reasonably priced on Amazon. Tons of information. And you've got 49 episodes on your podcast, The Case Against. So
49 and counting.
Counting, right. So people go check those out. Again, it's Gary Meece, Meece. Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you, William. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.